Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining. My name is Tracy Cook, and I'm the Online Media Manager for ModernAnalyst.com, the premier community for business analysts. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar entitled The Business Analyst Big Data Challenge. Today's featured speaker is Julie Hyman, the Senior Product Manager at Dell Software. The webinar will last approximately 60 minutes, including the question and answer session at the end. Please be sure to submit your questions in advance using the question feature of the GoToWebinar software. I'd like to say thank you to Dell Software for sponsoring today's event. And now it is my pleasure to welcome Julie Hyman. Julie, please take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tracy. And thanks everybody for joining today. I was excited on the topic for this webinar today because this is something that we grapple with every day as analysts. And so I'm excited to kind of go through this with you. Let me start with the basics. They always want me to put my bio up here and my picture. So basically, I've been doing software product management for the past 23 plus years, working both in software products and really on business intelligence and how companies pull important data out of software products. And so currently, I'm the Senior Product Manager for the Toad Data Point and Intelligence Central applications. Working closely with all of Dell's customers, trying to get simplicity into their solutions through our product line. So let's talk about the big data challenge. Okay, so our conversation today is going to be about how data analysts can work effectively when they need to bridge the gap between all the different data sources available to them. And that's everything from Excel, which we're going to talk a lot about today, to standard transactional relational databases, right? SQL Server, Oracle, data warehouses, Vertica, Teradata, Greenplum, and all of the new, really emerging NoSQL sources, Cassandra, Hadoop, Mongo. And so as data analysts, we have to do our analysis and our reporting, get our data out to the business, either as raw data that's already been cleansed and prepped, or as actual analysis out to our constituents, right, our consumers, regardless of where the sources come from. And that's a really challenging proposition, which is why I love this. Because today's companies are really, the baseline is that they're expected to be data-driven, right? It's like a cliche, we're data-driven, which means the onus goes on the analyst to get the data out to the organization. And there is no organization out there, at least none that I'm aware of, that's willing to put the processes they have in place on hold as you sort of retool for new databases, right? You have to shift in flight, even when producing the same data sets or better data sets as all of these data sources are radically shifting. Let's talk about what I mean when I say data sources are radically shifting. Okay, so this is a graphic that I borrowed, just talking about basically how databases in general have stayed pretty much the same for the past 20 plus years, okay? So SQL as a language was first introduced in the mid-1970s, believe it or not. I know I took my first lesson in SQL language, right, select star from where, in the 80s. And really, although there's nuances and new functions that are available, the structure, right, the basic language is the same. What I learned then serves me now. And there's not a lot of technology around that has that lifespan in the industry. In 1986, it was the ANSI standard, and it's pretty much stayed the standard since then. So if you look at this diagram, everything above the line are different flavors of relational databases, and some of them are statistical databases, so they're a little bit more nuanced, things like Aster, Oracle Exadata. But basically, it's the same kind of data structure where you decide the schema beforehand. The schema is set, and then you pump the data into the schema, and then you use something like SQL or the particular flavor of SQL, PLSQL or T-SQL, to pull the data out, right? So it's pretty standard, just nuances. But if you look down in the last really 10 years, you see everything below the line, and this is where NoSQL databases have arisen, and they've been called big data databases, they've been called cloud databases, but I think really the key is that they're no SQL databases. And that's really the key for us as analysts, because SQL has been the baseline that we've been working with, right? You can throw us a new version of Teradata, a new Netezza, a new Aster. As long as it's got tables and views and things like that, we can deal with it. But NoSQL, right? It's really changed how that data is accessed and stored and how it's utilized, right? So taking that into account, let's go back to our heroic analysts out there hanging in space, right? Trying to produce the same or better data sets and analysis as the fundamental way that data is stored is changing. And again, we never have the luxury of one day being relationally based and the next day being NoSQL based, right? We're going to be both for a long time. So let's talk about the best approach to that. So in data prepping, right, for the future, it really is a balance, right? And the tooling and the processes and the skills you need really need to strike that balance where we are still working effectively and successfully with the old, but we are constantly incorporating the new. So again, we don't have the luxury of stopping what we do and retooling for a new set of data sources. No one's going to go home on Friday with one data source and come back in on Monday and everything's changed, right? It's a process. And so really it's that balance between old and new. And so we really need to nail those old processes, make sure we're doing them successfully, efficiently, succinctly, and they're serving the business, which is what all data does, at the same time incorporating that new into the process so that we're making use of these new sources. And as our IT is rolling out these NoSQL sources, we're able to incorporate and prove their value through our reporting and analysis. Okay. The metaphor, or the way we're going to talk about this, since there's so many databases out there, is we're going to talk about blending yesterday with today. And the best way to talk about that is talk about Excel, right, and big data, because no two things could be farther on the spectrum. Although you could make an argument that Excel was the first sort of unstructured data source where you could add anything into it. Certainly wasn't big data, but unstructured, definitely part of it. So let's talk about how can I get value as an analyst? How can I provide my consumers, my data consumers within my organization with value when I have data that's spread across such a wide variety of sources here, right? So let's first talk about Excel and why I truly believe it is still something that needs to be seriously considered when you're looking at how you tool up for data analysis. And first of all, arguably, and I would love to make this argument because I think it's just such a winning argument, it's still the most widely used, BI tool in the world. I was recently reading a question on a really popular forum that just basically said, why are people considering to use Excel as a pseudo database? And I think the question was posed based on how it was written by a developer who clearly had maybe a little bit of disregard for Excel as a database. And the answer, there were a ton of really long, detailed answers, but the one that floated to the top was because it works. Mic drop, right? It works and it gets the job done, right? It's an obvious oversimplification, but if you unpack that, Excel is something that most people can use, that most people have, most people can count on other people having, so they can send their data out to others in an Excel format with a pretty good, strong assurance that they'll be able to open it. They can change their mind as they're developing it and add new columns. They don't have to have IT interference helping them design databases. They don't have to understand adding users, granting rights, creating schemas, foreign keys, none of that, right? And so it works for the average user. And so data, until there is a similar, simple solution that a business user can spin up and use, Excel will always be used for databases. Now, hopefully it's not your core database and holding your core data, but it is probably holding some ancillary data that is important to your overall analysis. So Excel is here. It'll be here for a while until something better comes along, and there's been a lot of better things that have come along that haven't replaced it yet, so I think we should get used to it. So Excel today is used, and this is a good way of breaking it down. It's used as both a database, right, a source of data, and an analysis tool, right, where I put my data after I've cleansed and prepped it, and I can build my graphs and my pivots, my crosstabs. I can pull it in there, and then I can send a workbook out to people that has the back-end data and the front-end analysis, right, your dashboard, sheet one, and all the detail behind it. So it's used both as a database and analysis tool. Now, what it should be used for is an analysis tool. That's what it was built for. But people will continue to use it as a database for all the reasons that I've mentioned. A couple of things I wanted to mention here. It has a row limit, right? So when we talk about big data and the growth of data, right, velocity and volume, you got to have to think about a row limit with Excel, which is one of the reasons why it can't support a lot of data. And I think it has about a million row limit now, and Excel 2016 has the same row limit. And that is not going away, and that is a considerable row limit for some people, right? We're hitting that row limit more often than we were, let's say, 7 years ago. Now, there is Power BI, which is the Excel sort of add-in, I guess is the way to call it, that you can go beyond that row limit. So keep that in mind. But what I see with Power BI and Power Pivot, which is the Excel product, they're really not picked up as widely as Excel. So I'm not sure of exactly why. I have a lot of opinions, and it's an interesting conversation about why we aren't all using Power Pivot more. But with Power Pivot, you can't expand beyond that row limit. So just before anyone calls me out about that, it is there. But just Power Pivot isn't the standard that just plain old Excel workbooks are. Okay, so that's why we use Excel. It's there. It's easy. We've got it. It gets the job done.
Julie,
why?
Our first question, is there any standard models from a business analysis perspective to follow while initiating a big data project?
Yeah, there are some really great standards out there about big data and what you can do. One of the interesting things about big data, and I'll talk about it here in a second, we'll dive a little deeper, is it's one of those great technologies that you can do so much with. And while that is amazing, right, that you have this power, it also means it has very few limits, right? It doesn't have pre-built templates, right? So it's that whole conversation is, well, can we do this with it? Yeah, sure, you can do anything with it. But of course, when you're dealing with a technology where you can do anything, it can quickly devolve into doing nothing because you have to come up with all of your own limits and boundaries, right? It doesn't come pre-built with those, right? Which is great. No limits and boundaries are great, but every project has limits and boundaries that you have to build. So, I'll try at the end here, if you can remind me, Tracy, to give some good resources about good approaches to kicking off big data projects and where you can, get your requirements, right? So that you can put those boundaries and limits in, and don't let the limitlessness of big data actually become a hindrance. So hopefully that makes sense. We'll dive into it a little bit more.
Wonderful, thanks.
Okay, sure. So why do people use NoSQL, right? What's the appeal of NoSQL? It's scale and power, right? NoSQL is scalable and it has incredible performance, right? And the data model is significantly different than a relational data model, and it meets these sort of 4 criteria that really make it fast. And when I mean fast, not just fast in performance, but fast in growth, right? Fast in change, which is what everything's about nowadays, right? Truly an agile product. So large volumes of data, rapidly changing, you can put it into big data, right? If your data changes tomorrow, you want to add new kinds of data, you've got log data, you've got Twitter data, you've got review data, you've got regular data, it all fits in with very little pre-prep involved, right? Agile sprints, it's built with the kind of idea that you can get things in quickly. When we talk about IT and relational databases, you're always going to get into a conversation with backlog, right? You need a DBA to make a change, they need to roll that out. All of that ends up with these long timelines involved with making a change to a relational model. But a NoSQL model can change fast. It's built to change fast, right? The technology is built to accept those change quicker. It's object-oriented programming, so while that might not mean anything to us, as analysts, it means a lot to the developers, right? So it's easier for developers to use, and that makes it faster for them to meet our requirements. And then just by its very nature, the fact of how it's built, right, it's not sort of a pre-built database with predefined schemas. It is built to be geographically distributed. It's a scale-out architecture. Instead of, a single box, you have multiple scaled boxes, and the way the technology works is automatically taking that into account. And that's why we have growth of things like Facebook and Twitter and Google and all these big data sources that are global, right? There's no big database out there that has all the Google in it, right? So hopefully we all realize that, even if it's just intuitively, it is distributed, right? There's lots of little Googles all over the world, all feeding into this one model, and that's what NoSQL gets us. Okay, so what are our challenges as analysts with NoSQL? The first challenge is dynamic schemas. So what that means is when we walk into a relational database world, we know, right, someone will sit down, if we're super lucky, with us and describe the database schema, right? Customer names are in this table, customer addresses are in this table, there's a foreign, a join table that you can use to bring the two together, right? That's a pre-thought out schema, right? And it really follows this old school methodology of you want to start storing data, let's stop. Let's think about the data that you want to store. Let's plan out what data you want to store, and then we'll build your repository. You can start storing data. NoSQL blows that all out of the water, right? NoSQL's databases let you act first and think later, right? If you have data that you want to store in a NoSQL environment, you just store it. You store it with some attributes, right? There's a certain structure to it, but the structure is following the data itself and not the data going into a structure that's pre-planned. So the takeaway from that very high-level discussion of something that's very technical is it's dynamic. The schema can change daily, right? When you have new data, you put it in and then you figure out later how you want to take it out. So the thinking happens after the fact, right? Let's store and pump all our data into this highly scalable, distributed network so we don't ever lose it, and then let's look at it and see if it has value to our business and think about how we can use that data to have value, versus let's sit down at the very beginning, think about all the data we might want to collect, create a place for that to be, and then collect it in there. Okay, so hopefully you understand the challenge with a dynamic schema is it's not pre-planned for you. You're not walking into a pre-planned environment. The other challenge, which is pretty basic but understandable, I think, with data, and maybe one that some folks don't think about, is just huge data volume, right? Our back-end systems, right, our cloud sources, our servers have evolved a lot more quickly than our workstations. Our workstations still run into memory issues, right? You can throw a lot of RAM on there, but I'm sure you've all had workstations that seized up, that stopped, that froze, that had this long stall in the middle of what you're doing because you just asked it to do too much. And it could be something as simple as you have Excel up, you got Word up, you got Outlook up, and you run a query, and boom, all of a sudden you're stalled, right? You probably, looking at the surveys that we get and the data, a lot of you are still running 32-bit workstations. So here we're talking about volume and velocity and variety in data, and we're working on 32-bit workstations where someone's just given us a little bit more RAM, right? So, okay, so all of that means is that when we're dealing with huge volumes of data, we have to think about ways as analysts where we can use our workstation to model what the kind of analysis or the kind of data prep that we want to do, and then we want to deploy or publish that model into a server where it can actually run that model for us, and that we don't have to run it on our desktop, right? So we don't want to pass all of these large amounts of data through sort of a rinky-dink workstation or a relatively rinky-dink workstation and then pass it back out into the server world. We want to just grab a little bit, a little sample, bring it in, do our analysis modeling, do our thinking about that data and how we're going to create value from that data and what it can teach us about our business, and then we want to deploy, publish that model into a server. So when you think about how to deal with these environments, you have to start thinking about big data means not everything can move on the workstation. Whereas in Excel, it deals really well with the workstation. Okay, so is there one tool, one set of processes out there that can let you do it all, right? Because that's what we have to do, right? That balance between super effective with Excel, because we can't ignore that, but also ready to incorporate NoSQL and schema-less environments and huge amounts of data. So is there a tool set out there that can do that? And that you can do it in a really pragmatic and hopefully affordable way, right? Because you can always throw money at a problem, but you want to be able to do it in a way that's very practical for the value you're going to get from it. And so these are the things that I would recommend from our experience that you look for in an analyst tool, and it's what we use as our guidelines in building the tool sets that we produce. So first of all, should be a single tool, right? Switching tools wastes time. It makes it hard to share and intermingle work and data. Most of the databases out there, most of the database platform vendors will have a tool set that allows you to deal effectively with their database platform. And some of them will also allow you to deal somewhat effectively with other database platforms, right? They're open connectivity, they say. But really, they are geared toward their particular point of view, right? So as an example, Oracle is not going to build a tool that is going to be highly efficient with Vertica, right? Or they're not going to build a tool or spend money investing and hiring developers to come up with a MongoDB solution. They might get you an Exadata solution, right, keeping you within that Oracle brand. But they're spending their money on solving their problems that are promoting their brand. So a single tool that can switch between them all pretty much has to be data platform agnostic. And obviously it needs to be able to connect to everything, but I would also be wary of who the builder or the funder of that software is, because there are platforms, you know, there are, like I said, there are tools out there like SQL Developer, SQL Workbench, someone just brought it to me the other day. These are tools out there that are really meant to deal with a particular platform, although they do have other connectivity options. But you really want to look for a vendor that's going to invest in the overall workflow versus nailing their brand. So that connectivity. Okay, so when you talk about connectivity, you need to look at all of it, right? Now, a lot of times as analysts, we think, well, I just work in Oracle, right? And I have a lot of folks that we start the conversation that way. I just work in Oracle. I just work in SQL Server. I find it really rare that that's 100% true. I find that when we expand the conversation, what we find is that they're mostly Oracle or mostly SQL Server, or based on the limitations that were there before, they've only really thought about Oracle or SQL Server. But you really need to be able to connect to a wide variety of things so that you're not excluding spreadsheets. You're not requiring ETL processes to bring data that isn't really necessary into a data warehouse just because you need to join it into a particular query. Right? That's a lot of IT workflow that you're initiating, a lot of IT work to get data in there just so that you can query it back out, whereas if you could just connect to those two sources independently, you could produce the same results without having to actually make it an IT process. So it's something to think about where other data sources lay. And what you also need to think about is the future. You might be mostly Oracle today, but are you going to be mostly Oracle tomorrow, right? As all of our companies try to look at budget issues and switching vendors to sort of gravitate towards some more cloud sources, some more off-site resources that they're doing, are you going to be able to adapt to that easily, or are you going to be able to come back and say, well, if we switch to Oracle, I've got to retool my whole department, right? We don't know how to use that source, or we don't have an effective tool. So just something to think about. You want that connectivity, you should be able to demand that from your product, right? That it has that uber connectivity and it's not going to limit you. Third is a centralized collaboration layer. Okay, so this is really about a couple of things. This is about what I talked about, first of all, about modeling. right? So if you're dealing with large amounts of data, you really can't ask that of your workstation instantly. So what you need is a process where you can model on your workstation and then publish into a server environment. And that might be an on-prem server today, and it might be a cloud server tomorrow. But you want to have that handoff between sort of the workstation, that lower end technology that you've enabled all your employees with, to that higher end technology, that bigger investment that has the more power, right? Because that tends to be the way we work, is that our workstations have less power than our servers. Pretty basic. So you want something that takes that into account. And that's really kind of twofold too, because when you have something on the workstation, you do have more manipulative power. So what I mean is you've got more tools in front of that user where they can quickly click in and do more things, and that's a great model. But then you want to be able to push that to a server so that it can do the larger volumes, right? The faster processing, the speedier results. And so you don't want something that's all servers, because you might be cutting back on features and what manipulations you can do. And maybe you don't want something all workstation, because you're eventually building yourself a cliff as far as how much data you can deal with. So keeping those two things in mind, a good solution should have a little bit of both. And then I think you need to think about how your consumers are going to consume the data, right? Because ultimately that's what we do, right? We produce either data or analysis, right? Next step along the line, that eventually is going to go in front of consumers. Very few of us are one-man teams where we're the only ones consuming our analysis, right? So we need to see what kind of server solutions are out there so that I can publish my analysis and my data out there so other people can consume it without necessarily having to pay a license for those people, right? You don't want to, if you've got 10 people who are your producers, you really want to invest in those producers, those 10 people who have to do the data prep, the query. And then if you've got 500 consumers, you don't want to have to break the bank just for them to consume the analysis, right? So you want to have a good mix there where your consumers should almost be free. Nothing's completely free, but should almost be the lightweight part of the solution. And really you want to invest in that data prep part, because actually that's a lot of the heavy lifting with analysis is in data prep. And then lastly, you don't want a large IT time investment, right? You want easy for the business, for the analyst to manage, right? One of the reasons why we've moved more and more towards self-service, and it's been like the top search terms in BI for the last few years, is because we realized that large IT time investment means doesn't get done. Wait, there's a long wait. There's a huge amount of time investment. There's a huge amount of frustration by the business. IT cannot be our shepherds through this process. They need to set some guidelines, some boundaries for us. We need to work within their rules, but we need to be able to work on our own. We need to be able to manage our own environment. And then lastly, you want all of this. Sounds like an awful lot, but it should be quick to set up and get running, and it should be really affordable, right? You don't want to do all of your investment here. There's other things to invest in, but you want to make the right investment to make sure that your folks have the right tooling, but it should still be an affordable proposition. Okay. So that's what you're looking for in a tool, and this is what we at Toad provide, right, that we think meets that criteria and continue to grow to blossom into all that criteria in the future as well. That's our path. Those things that I just went through is the path for this tooling. And there's two products involved here, right? One is a workstation product, Toad Data Point, and one is a server-based product, Toad Intelligence Central. Right now it's an on-prem server product, but it is moving toward cloud as well. So within the next 12 months or so, you'll see it move to cloud. So it's constantly evolving, as the technologies evolve and as our workflows evolve. I'm going to show you a couple of things about these products now, and I'm just going to hit the highlights. And again, I'm going to focus on Excel and NoSQL and show you some screens about how we connect and work effectively with those sources and then let those sources interact. So we'll go into that. Before I switch over, though, I wanted to, because not everyone can stay for the full time. So what I wanted to do is point out a couple of resources for you where you can learn about all this stuff on your own. So first of all, we have an amazing community called Toad World. www.toadworld.com, and you can navigate through there to the product section and look up Toad data points, just a couple of menu clicks. And all of our products are available for 30-day trials right off the bat, just by downloading, and they're full products, so you're not going to get a limited product. And you can 30-day trial the workstation, and you can 30-day trial the server. You know, and by the way, I want to mention that you can just go with just a workstation solution. You don't need to incorporate the server. The server is sort of an add-on piece that extends that capability through that modeling and publishing concepts. But you can start with the workstation and then, you know, move into the server piece eventually if you want to do that. So you can go ahead and trial either or both of those products here. And then we also have a really great case study, and I really like this case study. It's close to my heart. It's Philadelphia Youth Network, which is a great nonprofit that we've been working with for years, who ran into a lot of data challenges and didn't have a lot of money to invest, but really needed to break some barriers by using their data. And so they are great users of Toad Data Point, and really give us a great case study about how they use it to really re-energize what they do. And so there's a link out here, which is incredibly long, the URL, but you could also just Google Toad Data Point PYN for Philadelphia Youth Network and get to that case study. It's got a video on it. Just really great people doing really great things, and we're happy that we're able to help them with our tooling. So, having said all of that, I'm going to switch over now to the desktop tool. So we have, as I mentioned, we have two components to the full solution. There's this desktop tool, and you can see just by looking at it that it's very rich in features and functionality. I got a rich ribbon bar with lots of things to do. I can show you, and I'll walk through here and show you what you can do through this environment. I'm going to also just quickly go here and show you that this is the server piece, and so this is how you interact with the server piece, just through a browser. Right, so here I've got just a basic server environment that I'm publishing into, that's running my models, that's producing data for users to consume, whether those data is workbooks or single data sets or refreshing data sets. There's all sorts of ways that you can make data available to your users and they can consume it. And then just to hit on this for a second, because we won't talk about this too much as we go through the screens, this screen that I'm actually looking at right now is an overview of what I have published out there, you know, what's being consumed in that environment, how often it's being consumed, what my most popular items are. And by popular, I mean things that are being consumed by others either through this web front end, or you can connect up to this server environment through other third-party tools that you might want to use for further analysis, like ClickTech or Tableau or Sisense. Anything can connect up to this environment to consume the results of either your data prep or a step further, your actual data analysis. So I'll hit this screen, but just to show you there's two components here. I'm going to stick mostly in this component because this is really where you're rolling up your sleeve as an analyst and doing the prep work. Okay, so the first things I want to show here, I'm just going to show off some screens, and if you have questions about the functionality, please feel free to add them to the chat, and Tracy will ask them out for you. But I want to show you over here on the left-hand side of the screen is my navigation manager. And I know it's hard to see because it's very small, but through the webinar. But what I want to get across here is that this product has super connectivity. So these are all of the different data sources that I've connected to in my environment, which is admittedly very rich in data sources. I've got DynamoDBs, I've got a Redshift DB, I've got Apache, both HBase and Hive. I'm connecting to Google Analytics and pulling down analytics on websites. I've got DB2 and Oracle and SQL Server. Probably not typical that there's this many data sources, but it has that capability. So let me look at the full list of what we can connect to so that we can talk about it. Because again, that super connectivity is what you need to demand from your vendors, whoever they are, because it's the baseline. If you can connect to it, you can deal with it. If you can't connect to it, then you have to figure out a way to ETL it into something else. So First of all, file data sources, never to be ignored. And we consider Access a file data source as well because it really is workstation-based typically. Separated value files, Access, Excel, these should be data sources right on par with anything else. So you should be able to bring these into your environment as data sources. Remember we talked about how Excel is built to be an analysis tool, so people use it like a database. So if they're using it like a database, you need to be able to treat it like a database and bring it into your environment, and I'll show you that in a minute. You should have a wide range of relational data sources. So all the things listed here from Teradata, SAP HANA, which is an in-memory data source but still relational in nature, Netezza, all of these here, we consistently keep up to date with the newest versions with all these providers. And that's how we list them all here. So we're either using native drivers or specific ODBC drivers to connect. But we also have this wide-ranging ODBC generic connectivity. So I have users who are connecting to Fox Pro, FileMaker Pro, all sorts of data just through ODBC. So just because we don't list it here doesn't mean we can't connect to it. If you can connect to it through an ODBC 3.0 standard, we can connect and query. So those are relational. Business intelligence sources, and I think this is one of the areas where our product really shines. Things like Google Analytics, things like Oracle Business Intelligence semantic layer, right? Your OBIEE semantic layer is something that's not a database at all, right? It's a definition layer between you and a back-end system. It's really a reporting layer, and we can connect directly to that. Same thing with SAP Business Objects. You can connect directly into those semantic layers. So if your BI group has already put the energy into organizing the data into reporting formats, reporting schemas, right, and they don't want to give you access to the back-end raw data, they want you to filter it through what they've already done, you can do that with DataPoint. You can connect directly to these sources here and query that data. And I'm going to show you when I say query that data, everything you bring into DataPoint you query the same way. You don't have to learn DB2, Oracle, HANA, Oracle BI. You just have to learn DataPoint. And once you learn DataPoint, you can query across all these sources. And then the last group is really our biggest growing category with the NoSQL sources. So I'm going to work with Mongo today, but we've got HBase and Hive, which is our way of dealing with Hadoop. We've got Cloudera Impala, right, which is a flavor of Impala that is we certify with Dynamo, and continuing to grow this list as we see what's getting adopted in the market. And we will continue to do that. So we are investing consistently into expanding these connection lists. And you don't pay per connection in our system. You get the full list. We do have a base version where we just stick in the relational database world, and then there's the professional version where we really expand out to relational and everything else. So it's not as though you have to, again, know beforehand where your company's moving. If you invest in something like DataPoint, you're going to be prepared for wherever you go in the future. We're going to probably have a connector built for that. Okay, so that's the connection. So let me talk for a second about Excel and how we handle Excel, since we started with there. So first of all, Excel for us is a data source. So I've got this account right here, Restaurant Managers and Social Accounts, and it's a source. So I can switch to it. It's going to automatically detect whatever sheets I've got in there. If I've already set up ranges, it'll detect those ranges. You know, based on column names, it's going to detect what my column names are. I mean, it's going to look like this is a table and this is a database. That's how we treat it. When you query Excel in our system, it's just a matter of dragging and dropping, right? So I'll take this off so we can see. I just drag this here and I drop it in here and I pick which fields I want. I can add where clauses or group clauses or having. I can do all this. Now I'm using a visual environment because I am not a SQL coder. I'm not comfortable in SQL, but I could be. I could be using a SQL environment as well and pull it and be writing it in SQL. And it has all the bells and whistles you would expect from an SQL, a good SQL editor, right? And you really should insist on this with a good SQL editor, right? You don't just want a notepad. You want something that's going to help you, right? Pop up and doing what we call IntelliSense, and intelligently sense what you're doing. You want something where you can store code snippets or saved queries that you could then build on and different things like that. So you want to have a really robust SQL editor that has all the bells and whistles. If you're going to be living in this tool every day, if it's your primary tool, you should have that. So what I'm building here is SQL against Excel, because that's what our connector does. It'll let you use that standard query language against sources that aren't necessarily SQL friendly, right? And so this is Excel that we're doing it with. You run your result sets. You can look at multiple result sets. You can, sort and filter and all those bells and whistles in what you do. It's very easy, and it's just I bring it in here. So that's using Excel as a data source. We don't just use Excel as data source. We also use Excel as a data output, an analysis part of the product, right? So you can always quick export to Excel in all sorts of different flavors. So if Excel is your brand of data analysis, right? You like to do it in Excel, or you like to be able to communicate with others in your company as Excel is sort of your common denominator, you can do that with DataPoint. We always respect the Excel. That's one of our tenets. So we have a full export wizard where you can export your data results to any kind of format. And I'm just doing quick results here, but these could be cleansed and prepped results and have had some manipulation to them, or they could be straight data results based on query. All sorts of things out to Excel, SQL scripts, delimited text, HTML, tables, access. You have a wide variety of choices here. You can even take data that you query here and put it into other databases that you have on your data list here. So I can either stash it in my local sandbox, which comes pre-built in the product. It's a MySQL instance that comes pre-built, or you could actually do it what we call an import, where I pull from Excel and I put it in a SQL server, right? So you can do that as well. So there's a wide variety of outputs, but Excel is one of our primary outputs that we always respect, and that's why you'll always have on nearly every grid in the system, you have this quick export where you can just cut to the chase and get it to Excel. Okay, so that's Excel as a source and Excel as a output. You can also use Excel as a enhancer. It's a strange word, but I'll say what I mean by that. So if I'm writing a query and I want to limit the number of restaurant IDs that come back, these are restaurants with all of their social media and web presence, is what my data is about. And I want to limit what restaurant IDs that come back. I mean, this is a list of 1 million restaurants. I just want a certain number. I can actually go out and access an Excel file that has just a list of the IDs that I wanted to use. Let's get the right, there we go. Here, this is just a list of the IDs that I want. So here's a list of IDs I pulled in from Excel, so that, in other words, what I'm creating here is fairly, if not complicated, certainly tedious SQL, right? Using these, putting all these values in for my limiters. Whereas going out to Excel and just extracting a list of the values that I want is super simple, right? And I could be doing this from Excel. I'm using Excel here. I could do this just from a notepad if I wanted to, and just point at a text file here. But just another way where we kind of embrace Excel into the whole workflow experience. Okay. So that is sort of what we do with Excel. I'll hit it back a little bit later. So let me talk a little bit about NoSQL, right? So where are we with NoSQL? So how easy is it to do NoSQL? Well, really easy. It's the same process. So here, I've got a MongoDB instance, right? A fully NoSQL environment. Now, someone has set up my collections and my documents and sub-documents, and so then I'm switching to my Mongo language. But as a user, I'm just connecting. And when I connect to this Mongo environment, it's very simple. Mongo itself is really simple, right? It's a host, it's a port, it's a database. And my particular one doesn't even need a username or password just because of how it's set up, right? And so just upon connection, DataPoint is interrogating that environment and giving me all of the collections already pre-built so that they look like tables. And so what do I mean by that? Let me go here and go here. So here's just grabbing, actually I'll do a new one, grabbing the tables from Mongo and adding them to this environment. Okay, now in this case, there's no foreign key relationship. Remember we talked about schema lists. In building collections, they could specify keys, but they typically don't, or at least most of the instances I've dealt with. but that's how you establish a key and data point, right? A drag and a drop. You need to jump more into it. You can actually go into options, and you can do inners and outers and all sorts of joins, left and right, and picking fields, right? So what is this doing? It is building SQL, but SQL that will engine and be executed against this Mongo environment, right? So again, I'm not learning anything new just because we're using Mongo. I've learned how to use DataPoint, and DataPoint does that translation back to that backend database. I don't need to learn anything new as an analyst. I might need to learn just some tiny nuances to how the data is structured, and we have things like diagrams and notes and collaboration that allow us to expose that knowledge across a team. And so we can do that, but as far as query, super simple, right? I can just query that database as a source without having to learn anything about what a collection is versus documents and subdocuments or anything like that. Okay, so I just want to get that across. And again, I could be doing it here. I could be doing it in an editor if I prefer to type. It has all the same IntelliSense. Again, the system bridges that gap between the technology and my skill set. Okay, so we can connect to Excel as a source. We can connect to Mongo as a source. I have all these great features in front of me. I can connect to Excel and Mongo as a source within the same query, right? So I could use my two Mongo tables with a little leaf on it. This is my Excel spreadsheet. I've joined them all together by dragging and dropping different keys relating back to my Excel spreadsheet. I've run this query. It took me 1 minute, 0.5 second, or 1 minute, 15 seconds, sorry, to run this query, bring it all back. It's just a 41,000 record query based on that exclusionary join that I added, right? This is only going to bring back data from Mongo that matches the data from Excel, so it excludes a lot of that Mongo data. And here it is in a single data set. Here's all my fields from Excel matched directly to all my fields from Mongo. So the power that you can have by joining your data together in a single query means that you're not having to move the data into different sources just to get a result set with it matched together. You can do it through the query and let the tool do the work for you. Now, I might do this just with the 41,000 records here, and then I might decide this looks great. I'd like to stage this out on my server and have my server go against a larger data set, right? This is just my model. How do I do that? I publish it. I publish it into that server environment, right? And I can have multiple server environments that I'm reporting to. This is the Intelligence Central piece. I can pick folders to publish it into. I can choose whether I want to publish it as a static piece of data, as a snapshot that's going to automatically refresh on its own. I don't need any interference. That server is going to refresh that data both from Excel as well as from Mongo in this case on whatever schedule I provide. Or I could do it as a view where what is staged in that collaborative shared server environment is not the data, it's just the query and the connectivity, so that someone else who goes out to that server environment, let's say through this front end on the web, is going to actually kick off those back-end queries and return live data. So I have so many choices about how I want to take what I've modeled on my desktop and push it out to those users, consumers. And I myself could be a consumer. I could stage portions of data out there and then re-query it back in, right? Because a lot of times you have to sort of build your data up off of multiple data sets or multiple filters or multiple different iterations. So just to give you an idea there, and then I'll just hit one more
Julie,
screen.
just a quick
question.
Julie, just a quick question.
Sure.
Can the results or the data be published on SharePoint?
It can. So part of what I can do here on my exporting is send to SharePoint, to a SharePoint list, right? Because this is list data by nature. It can be shared out to a SharePoint. So yes, it can.
Excellent. Thank you.
And then, by the way, SharePoint is also a source, so you can also be pulling in from a SharePoint list as well. Okay, so the last screen I'm going to hit on before there's more questions, sorry, there's a little noise here on my side, is automation. So I've shown you what you can do, just a slight taste. Remember when I showed the metaphor for data point, I showed a Swiss Army knife. There's data compare, there's snippets, there's profiling of data, transformation cleanse. There's a lot to this tool. It's not enough to be able to show here, but just to give you a flavor. But one of the things I wanted to mention that I think is really important is automation. So anything that I do here, whether I'm doing it and then publishing my results into Intelligence Central or just doing analysis for myself, I can automate. And so what I mean by automate, and you can see this is sort of a drag and drop environment, right? I can drag actions, so say into my template and add them, and then add those actions, give those actions meaning through attributes, right? Very simple, and we have a ton of videos on how to do it. But it means that I can create a workflow. So I'll just give you a simple example here of a workflow. I'm just going to talk to this one so we get an idea. This is a super simple one that's very common with our users, and actually we built this one for a user that we were supporting and helping during some basic training, where they want to produce an email. This is how they communicate data out to their audience. They want to produce an email out to their management that has an Excel workbook attached to it, and that Excel workbook has 2 tabs of detailed data and then tabs of summary data that automatically get refreshed in the detail, right? Graphs and charts and pivots. Okay, so they have the Excel template out there. They make a copy of that template. They query address information. They populate one tab. They create an address summary. They populate a second tab of data. All right, so all of these actions are just populating out and setting up an Excel workbook out there. And then, if there are data, if the queries have returned back any rows at all, they will take that Excel workbook, they will attach it to an email, and send it out to their management constituents. If the data is empty, let's say there's no new addresses added to the system last night, and that's what this report is about, we'll assume, then they'll get an email saying, hey, there's nothing new to report, nothing to send, right? So there's 2 sets of things they can do here. If condition 1 is met, meaning that there's rows of data, attach an email and send it. If there's not, don't send it, or send an email that says no data tonight, right? Very simple process. They've added one more step here, which is a workbook, right? So it's an Excel workbook, and they publish it out here into this environment. So someone can go to Intelligence Central, right? They don't have to open an email and download the attachment. They can just go to a browser and download the attachment from here, right? So they can grab this analysis workbook directly from this web browser. They can just download that themselves. So they do that last step of publishing that workbook out there. And this is just an automation script. It's simple steps, very simple to create. You don't have to have any development experience to do just what I said. And then they schedule it. And they can either schedule it to run on their workstation if they just have the workstation solution, right? So as long as their PC is on, it will run. Or they could publish this into that server environment and hand off the responsibility of running this to that server and include other people within their group to manage that if something should go wrong or if they need to change it. So they can create a management structure so you're all got each other's back, so to speak, on these processes. And these processes can be super simple or they can be super complex, and it's just a matter of doing, using all the conditions that are out here. There's things like loop conditions and if conditions and variables you can set, and grouping and all sorts of things you can do, or you can keep it simple and just create a report and send it to somebody. So the power of a tool like this is in the doing and in the automating of what you've done, right? Because you want to move on to newer, more valuable problems to solve for your customers, your consumers. And you don't want to just be the person who's pushing the button every week, every month, every quarter to get the reports out, right? You want to set it and forget it and maybe come back in and model it in the future to make sure it's still meeting all of your requirements, setting thresholds, different things like that through automation variables so that it's sort of self-monitoring, but you don't want to have to be the one who's powering it all the time. Right? You want to hand that off. So a brief overview of the power of Data Point and Intelligence Central together. And again, its power is really in helping you nail the processes that you need to do today, right? Do them well, do them efficiently, and schedule and make them run automatically, right? Automate your work that you can with what you have today. Oracle, SQL Server, Excel. as well as be ready to grow into the future as you start bringing these new NoSQL environments on board. And that, back to my presentation, a lot of talking, but opening it up for Q&A, any questions that came in, Tracy, that you haven't had a chance to ask.
Absolutely, Julie. Now we only have about 5 minutes left, so I'll try and get them to them all. One question is, how does a tool treat duplicates? With large amounts of data, this is always a concern.
Yeah, it is. And so we have tools for dealing with duplicates. We have a whole engine, which I haven't touched on here, called Transformation and Cleanse. So Transformation and Cleanse is where you take a result set that's built off of a query. Here's where I'm just looking at my sample, right? Here's my ultimate query is out here. Pulling from here, I'm just choosing to look at the first 1,000 rows. So I just want to get a sample, but I could also choose a number of rows, percentage-wise or all rows. And here's where I can start to deal with duplicates and set up my duplicate rules, like what I want to do with the duplicates. And so deduplicate is what we call it. I figure out what do I mean by duplicate, right? How do I match it? What are the most important columns? Email, it might be an important column to match duplicates, as well as restaurant ID. The restaurant ID has to be an exact match. My email can be case insensitive, or even use a little double metaphone fuzzy logic if that's important to me. And then I choose what I want to do. Filter out one of the rows, filter out anything that has duplicates, and create a separate data stream that holds just my duplicates. Or do I want to just narrow it down to look just at my duplicates now so that I can deal with them? Transformation Cleanse we didn't hit on, but this is a great UI that gives you an overview of your data. How much is unique, how much is populated, distinct on every column that you're dealing with, including top patterns that you see in the data, right? So for example, this would be a pattern that I think is incorrect as far as an email, right? It shouldn't have a numeric. I can see that directly and see those 2 rows that meeting that that exception. And I can choose to deal with that exception. In this case, I'll just choose to replace, right, those number signs with 0, right? And I can just apply that as a rule. And so I set up a set of steps that I want to take against the data. So Transformation and Cleanse is where we deal with duplicates, and we have a whole bunch of ways of dealing with that, as well as dealing with all sorts of other anomalies in the data.
Excellent. Thanks, Julie. Next question is, can Toad use a VSAM file in mainframe environments as sources?
At this point, my answer is going to be no. And the only reason I say that is because I've never heard of us using that. But I have to say that my mainframe experience is really limited to the DB2 environment, and I really haven't had a lot of users ask me that. So I'm going to say no, with the caveat that we can typically connect to anything that, if we don't have it specifically listed, if there's an ODBC driver that the sources provider's written or someone else has written, you can use that to connect. But if my knowledge at this point would be, I haven't heard of that.
Thank you. Our next question, what kind of database does the intelligence server piece use?
So right now we use a MySQL engine as sort of both our what we call our parsing engine. So there's qualities about MySQL that made it easy for us to do that cross-query, develop these new connectors that we use, and we also use it as our storage engine. Now, next calendar year, we will be coming out with a data performance version of that using a data warehouse, which can store much, much more data as well. So MySQL is where we're at now. So if you're dealing with tens of millions of rows, we're typically still okay if that's the kind of data that you want to store as data sets or snapshots. If you're dealing with hundreds of millions of rows, that data performance edition that we have coming out, hopefully mid-next year is what it's slated for, would resolve that sort of big data volume issue.
Thanks, Julie. I'll just sneak in one more question here. It's actually a confirmation. So essentially, the automation part can replace all of our other ETL tools?
No. So ETL is a very specific technology, extract, transform, and load, We do great extract. We do fantastic transform. Unlike ETL tools, though, we don't really focus on the load part. So if you're really loading data, right, into large amounts of data into other database systems, whether those are NoSQL systems or other SQL systems, right, moving data, let's say, for example, between Oracle and Teradata. If you're doing it one time, right, a one-time migration, we might be able to help with that. Or it's a small piece, right, like every night you want to just move, a few thousand, 100,000 rows. But typically ETL deals with larger volume, and it also deals with synchronized data, right? A value of data changes over here and it triggers an update over there. We don't do that. Our loads on a lot of our systems are inserts versus, bulk updates. And so there's a performance issue that you're going to see if you're trying to use data point as an ETL. So there's fantastic ETL tools out there. I sometimes get caught saying data point can be used as a light ETL because I do have a lot of users that do use it that way, but they're dealing with smaller amounts of data. They're not trying to keep it up to date real time, and usually it's hard to say. Usually it's project based. Like for the next 4 months, we just need to keep these systems up to date, and we don't want to invest in a full ETL solution, which usually requires ETL developers, etc. So light ETL, but not an ETL replacement.
Excellent, Julie. Thank you very much. We have run out of time today, so I'd like to say thank you, Julie, so much for such a great presentation. We'd also like to thank all of our attendees today for attending the Modern Analyst webinar. And I'd like to remind everyone that today's webinar, along with the slides, will be archived at ModernAnalyst.com within a few business days. Thank you, and this concludes today's event. Have a great day.
Thank you.